الحمد لله الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد, as to what proceeds, we meet once again for our weekly meeting to study the text written by Shaykh Sa'id Raslan Hafidhahullah, known as Maratibu Talab al-Ilmi wa Turuq Tahsilihi, stages and means of seeking knowledge. In our previous meeting, we went through some of the statements in relation to the meaning of graduality in knowledge. And we took the statement of, or the incident of Abu Hanifa. And then after that, we took the statement of Zabnuji. And then we came to a famous statement which said that حفظ حرفين خير من سماء وقرين وفهم حرفين خير من حفظ وقرين. سماء وقرين and من حفظ وقرين. It says the memorizing two letters is better than hearing two notes, and understanding two letters is better than memorizing two notes. This statement, which has been said, حفظ حرفين خير من سماء وقرين وفهم حرفين خير من حفظ وقرين. This statement in reality clarifies for us that the thing which is most important when it comes to seeking knowledge is the quality of what is obtained, not the quantity. So if you were to memorize two letters, it is better than hearing two notes. And if you were to understand two letters, then it is better than memorizing two notes. So we have hifz and sama' in comparison to one another. So you have memorization and you have listening or auditing. Memorizing two words is better than listening two notes. And understanding two words is better than memorizing two notes. So in the first instance, or in the first couplet, memorization is better than listening to two notes. In the second couplet, understanding two letters is better than memorizing two notes. If you look at this beautiful statement, then you will see that the reality of many of the people today who seek knowledge fall under these circumstances. You see some that they pay attention to just attending as many lessons as they can without really memorizing anything from them. Whereas on the other hand, you find those who just give importance to memorizing, and they give no importance to comprehension and understanding. So these are the extremes that we have. Either somebody just attends and attentively and doesn't even memorize 2 words from those gatherings, remembers anything. Or somebody who attends so many gatherings, memorizes everything, but doesn't even understand 2 letters, not words, sorry, not words, letters, harfain that has been mentioned from those gatherings. So this is a beautiful statement to contemplate over. Then we read the statement of al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. It was said that a student of knowledge should not start learning a discipline all at one time. He should rather follow an organized strategy from the most important discipline, because it is impossible for anyone to learn all disciplines in a lifetime. So he shouldn't, the student of knowledge shouldn't start learning a discipline all at one time. That's why you find somebody who's learning the Arabic language, that he's studying Medina University books as well as Al-Arabiyyah Bayna Yadayk, and all these other, he's studying all 5 books at the same time, which all have a different methodology, which have advantages and disadvantages, plus points and minus points, but he wants to study all of them together. So when he pulls out his books, he's got Al-Arabiyyah Bayna Yadayk, Medina University books, and this book and this book and that book all together. So he thinks he's gonna be able to master the Arabic language all in one go, in one time. This is actually gonna result in failure. But rather he should follow an organized strategy. The organized strategy is a syllabus or recommendations by the people of knowledge. They tell you that, look, study this book first, don't study anything. Complete this book, master this book, and then move on to the next most important discipline, or the next book, which is in line, which is a bit more advanced. Even when the students go to college, you have the foundational level, then you have the intermediate level, and then you have what's the level after that? Advanced. So you have 3 levels, yes, the foundational, intermediate, and the advanced. You don't see no student, they won't allow no student when it comes to worldly knowledge to go and sit in the advanced level. They say, oh, you've done foundation or intermediate. Go first to the foundation, complete that, then complete the intermediate level, and then go to the advanced level. Because it is impossible for anyone to learn all disciplines in a lifetime. And this is something which a person should know. There are very few scholars from amongst whom Allah blessed. They were masters, that they mastered everything that they laid their hands on or was at their disposal. One of them is Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah. If you look at Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, his students say that when he spoke on that particular subject, you thought that Ibn Taymiyyah has not studied any other subject but this subject in his entire life. If he sat down to teach tafsir, that's what you would think about tafsir. If he sat down to teach aqeedah, this is what you would think about aqeedah. If he sat down to teach hadith, this is what you would think, that he's only studied hadith. That's why a famous statement goes about Ibn Taymiyyah, that if Ibn Taymiyyah does not know that hadith, then that hadith is most likely to be fabricated. If Ibn Taymiyyah did not come across that hadith, then there is a great probability that that narration is fabricated. So that's one of the scholars that I can recall now. The other is Shaykh al-Islam Sayyid Nadir Hussain Dahlawi. Same that was said about him. That's why they called him Shaykhul Kul fil Kul. That means the Shaykh and the master of all the subjects. He was nicknamed Shaykhul Kul fil Kul. This is what it means. That he was among every subject that he studied, he mastered. Once they asked him, his students, they said with regards to the i'rab of the Quran, how well do you know i'rab of the entire Quran? He said, I know the i'rab of the entire Quran just like I know my palm. That's how Allah has made it easy for me. But this is not possible for people like us. We cannot master all disciplines in a lifetime, so we have to prioritize. And this is what Ghazali is saying. The right thing to do is to learn the most important portions of every discipline. And I mentioned this about Medina University last week and the curriculum of Medina University. Why the curriculum of Medina University is so amazing? Because this vision was envisaged by the scholars of Medina. And the curriculum that they have set up in Medina actually teaches you or gives you access to the most important portions of every single discipline. It is strongly advisable for beginners to stick to a single discipline until they finish it. So this is the normal advice, or the general advice that is always given. Nasiha and nasiha amma is that you study one subject and you master that subject. So if you're learning Arabic, then focus on learning Arabic. If you're learning Aqeedah, then focus on learning Aqeedah. There is no harm to combine different subjects as long as you are able to balance your studies. And you do have somebody who can guide you and mentor you, and somebody who you can refer back to, so you don't overload yourself. And then move on to the other one. But that is what we know of the great scholars. Going back to the two scholars that I mentioned, when I read their biographies, I looked for similarities between the two of them. And I found out that both of them had something in common. They would pick a particular subject and master it before they moved on to another. So when they started to learn the Arabic language, they mastered the Arabic language. They read everything and studied everything that was at their disposal and was necessary or a necessity in their time. Then they moved on to the other subjects. For example, Nadir Hussain Dahlawi, when he traveled, he stopped in different places and studied with different sheikhs as he went along his journey until he reached Delhi, like we say, Delhi. When he reached Delhi, where he wanted to study with a muhaddith of Delhi, Shaykh Abdul Aziz al-Dahlawi. By the time he reached Delhi, Shaykh Abdul Aziz had died, and his grandson had taken his place, whom Shaykh al-Islam Nadir Hussain Dahlawi studied. But it shows on the way, if you read about his journey on the way, then he would stop at a particular place, would know of a particular scholar, and would study that fun or that discipline from him. The reason is that some disciplines are organized on levels and some aren't. If you're going to study a subject that doesn't have organized levels, it's going to be difficult. That's why you find in Medina University that most of the subjects now are taught with teachers' notes which are organized, because the students are not accustomed to read classical books which don't really have an organized sequence, but the knowledge is all there. So that's why you'll find a lot of students from Medina University, they're not able to grasp and understand and read classical texts. When I'm talking about students from Medina, I'm talking about the West. Whenever I mention students of Medina, know that it's in the context of students from the West who are studying in Medina University, not other parts of the world. Now, this is what was said by Ghazali. Then we move on now with regards to the statement which Abu Zainab will read. Now, after that which harms knowledge and its people. I think we read this, yes? Yes, we read this. So just before you start, Abu Zainab, the Shaykh then he mentioned here is that which is harmful to the students and its people is when the students restrict himself to gradual study of the subsidiary books that branched off the major books authored by major sheikhs. So we see this is a problem. Looking at the Arabic. So this is what he said, that that which harms knowledge and its people is when the students restrict himself to the graduate study of the books of the muta'akhirin. That was which was mentioned. Muta'akhirin mean that the later scholars in graduate study of the subsidiary books that branched off the major books authored by major sheikhs. Those subsidiary books have inflicted a serious damage on the educational process and those involved in it. This damage led most of the students to waste their time in studying them while missing the core fundamentals of disciplines found in the major books. So again, this a point that can be taken as a benefit from this statement is the talibul ilm should be zealous and should be enthusiastic to study the books of the earlier scholars and the ancient scholars. The later scholars who wrote books, he should benefit from them to build his aptitude and his level, but should not be reliant upon them and should not give more time than required. If he turns his attention away and restricts himself to these books that we see, then it will be detrimental for him that he will not be able to understand the core fundamentals. Yes, lubbul lubab, let me say. He will not be able to understand the core fundamentals, the lubbul lubab, or disciplines found in the major books. Now, so this is a thing which, and this is, I gave you the example in Medina University, that a lot of the studies now involve that you have a book, for example, that is part of the curriculum, and then the students never ever open that book because they're given notes on the first day of the semester. So it is as though that they just know that those notes, which is called a mudhakkira. If you go to the Jamia, you'll hear mudhakkirat, that's all the students talk about. Which mudhakkira we have to revise in order to pass this exam. So the mudhakkira may be beneficial in the sense that it may be laid out good, it may be simplified, it may have those issues which are problematic, it may have answers, it may give solutions. But that which becomes problematic is that when the reliance of the student becomes just on the mudhakkira and he doesn't go back to the asl. So for example, if Bidayatul Mujtahid, a book on fiqh, which is comparative, was mentioned, there's a mudhakkira for this, the student only goes to the mudhakkir. He never ever goes back to Bidayatul Mujtahid to make that comparison. That is where the harm is. And that's why you find, like I mentioned to you, students at Medina University, they didn't really read classical texts. They didn't read usul al-ilm. Usul al-ilm meaning the real books that were illustrated in that subject, like Bidayatul Mujtahid and others. They just stuck to those notes that were given. And there's some students, I can guarantee, they didn't even see those books. They don't even know. If you ask them what those books, they wouldn't know. They've never opened that book. And that's where the harm is. The balanced way is to benefit from the mudhakkira and have it next to the actual book. And in contrast, you study the mudhakkira, you study the mu'allaf of the muta'akhir, as well as usul al-ilm together. And that's what I did, alhamdulillah, throughout all my studies. I was only able to do that firstly with the tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with the guidance of the people of knowledge, as I referred back to them. Now, read. Ibn Khaldun. No, Salas, you can read the footnotes now.
على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Ibn Khaldun was an Arab Muslim historiographer and historian. He is regarded to be among the founding fathers of modern sociology, historiography, and economics. He is best known for his book, The Muqaddimah. He was born in 1332 and died in the year 1406. Ibn Khaldun are the same. Diversity of terminology and the multitude of authored books have afflicted serious damage in education, because a student is thereby demanded to memorize and recollect all of those terminologies, or at least most of them. Certainly, the student's lifetime is not enough to study all of the books authored in a single discipline. This, of course, has caused a significant lack in the acquisition of a given discipline. For instance, there are books that detail the Maliki school of jurisprudence. A seminal book in the school is named al-Mudawwana. Multiple explanations on it were authored by Ibn Yunus, al-Lakhmi, and Ibn Bashir. Furthermore, the student is required to study and distinguish between the various approaches to teach this Maliki school. Those approaches are taught in Baghdad, Qayrawan, Egypt, or in Cordoba, not to mention the approaches that were developed after them. While in reality, the lifetime is only enough for studying one approach only. If only teachers restricted themselves to teaching their students the basics of any discipline, learning would be much easier and beneficial. However, this above-mentioned method of education has become as rooted as an inborn nature resistant to any modification or change. Another instance is found in the book that explains the Arabic language from the book of Sibawayh. Abu Bishr Amr ibn Uthman ibn Qambar al-Bisri, commonly known as Sibawayh, was an influential linguist and grammarian of the Arabic language. His seminal work, Al-Kitab, was the first written grammar of the language. Despite his significance to the development of the Arabic language and linguistic tradition, Sibawayh was an ethnic Persian and wasn't a native Arabic speaker. Having learned the language later in life, he has been referred to as the greatest of all Arabic linguists and one of the greatest linguists of all time in any language. Source: Keith Steve, the Arabic linguistic tradition. Lots of commentaries were written in addition to the copious teaching approaches of different schools in Basra, Kufa, Baghdad, Andalusia, besides the approaches of scholars like Ibn al-Hajib, Ibn Malik, and others who taught this book. The student is demanded to cover these huge stacks of different books and approaches. It is extremely rare someone to cover all of them. Ibn Hisham. His full name is Abu Muhammad Abdullah Jamal al-Din ibn Yusuf ibn Hisham al-Ansari. He is Egyptian. He was born in Cairo in 708 after Hijrah. He died in the year 761 after Hijrah. He authored Sharh Aqsa al-Nada, Wabal al-Sada, Sharh Jashur al-Nada, Sharh al-Baha, Kutub al-Arif, and many others. So, one exception is Ibn Hisham, the Egyptian, who authored a book in grammar that reflects similar to that of Sibawayh, Ibn Jinni, and those on the same level as them. He mastered the fundamentals and everything related to grammar. Notably, such an extremely rare example proves that mastery is not exclusive to earlier scholars despite the aforementioned distractions. It all comes down to Allah, who gives whomever He wills. However, generally speaking, a student who spends his lifetime seeking to learn linguistics, which is merely a tool for the more important discipline, would not cover the entire subject. Ibn Khaldun 500. Ibn Khaldun wrote a very critical and a must-read chapter in his book. Everybody who is in the teaching profession must read, understand, and consider it as a measurement to which his teaching performance is measured. How to teach students? Ibn Khaldun remarked, education is effective if it follows a step-by-step process of teaching. Firstly, the fundamentals of any discipline are to be taught. The teacher should sum them up briefly to his students. He should be mindful of the student's level of intelligence and his readiness to receive these fundamentals throughout the learning process until the student has a good grip on the discipline. By this time, the student should have fostered a faculty in this given discipline, however weak it may be. The outcome of this faculty is preparing the student for a higher stage in learning this discipline. Given this higher stage, teacher should be able to iron out every single detail of this discipline and avoid generalization. Furthermore, associated differences of opinion in this discipline should be explained as well. This is to be observed all the way until the student masters this discipline, at which time his faculty would have significantly improved as well. The next stage, the teacher should resolve all the ambiguities of the discipline and clear them all to the student. By the end of this stage, the student will have sharpened his faculty to the background. Following this method, for repetition of teaching the given discipline will yield significant and efficient results. There can be some outstanding students who can achieve these results in a lesser time than suggested. Unfortunately, some contemporary teachers are unaware of these effective teaching methods. They not only present the ambiguous and advanced issues of the discipline at the outset of the learning process, but also demand the student to resolve these issues. They believe that this will help in advancing the student's intake of this discipline. They burden the student with absorbing huge amounts of information. The worst part of it, they mix the advanced part of this discipline with its beginnings before the student is even ready to build up an idea of what discipline is. Notably, the readiness to receive the content of any discipline is a gradual process. In the beginning, the student is unable to understand anything except minor parts. Therefore, a method of generalization and example work as a start. Then the development of this readiness through repetition, which pushes the student up to a higher stage of the absorption of this discipline. Reaching this level will end the stage of readiness and mark the beginning of a higher stage, named acquisition. Ibn Khaldun continues, presenting the advanced issues of any discipline at the beginning of the learning process, while bearing in mind the student's inability to understand, besides the difficulty of the discipline itself, will undoubtedly lead to some kind of laziness and distaste to continue learning this discipline. This unfortunate result is a product of following wrong educational methods. A teacher should not overburden the student with extra material other than the work he is already learning from. The teacher should operate in accordance with the student's ability and readiness to learn, be it a beginner or advanced student. The content of the material is not to be taught in mixture with other information. This should help the student to fully understand the material and sharpen his learning faculty. The significance of such faculty in preparing the student for the advanced level of any discipline. Moreover, it energizes the student's hunger for more and advances to higher levels until he masters the further discipline he studies. In contrast, failing to observe these methods will paralyze the student's ability to understand, waste his efforts, cast a sense of despair in ever learning a particular discipline, and eventually sever ties with learning. The teacher should not extend the intervals of time between sessions, because such interruption is a major cause of forgetfulness and lack of harmony. This would affect negatively on acquiring the faculty. On the other hand, continuous, uninterrupted sessions prevents forgetfulness, fostering faculty, and strengthening. Acquiring the faculty in any discipline requires constant and persistent repetition of studying, whereas it grows weaker with negligence in studying. A rule which must be observed in education is never teach two disciplines at once. It is very unlikely to master any of them because the student's attention is divided, which would impair the student's ability to understand both of them, and this will probably cause disappointment. On the contrary, devoting the student's attention to one discipline is very likely to yield promising results.
بارك الله فيك ونفع بك والإسلام والمسلمين. نعم. So the مقدمة of Ibn Khaldun is a very important book, and it has been translated into the English language. Although I don't recommend its English translation, but I think there is 2 or 3 translations. I think one translation from America, if I'm not mistaken, has been done by an Orientalist. It's supposed to be quite good. Wallahu a'lam. But anyway, the book should be read in the Arabic language, the book that it was illustrated in, because Ibn Khaldun himself, he has spoken in his Muqaddimah the importance of the Arabic language and how the Arabic language, thinking in the Arabic language, naturally helps you to develop your skills and helps you become more smart. The benefits of the Arabic language. Anyway, we have the English in front of us. Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, he said that, addressing the reader, he said, know that which harms, the most harmful thing for people when they seek knowledge, they are learning to seek knowledge, is diversity of terminologies on the multitude of authored books. So this is a harmful thing for the people. كثرة التآليف واختلاف الاصطلاحات في التعليم وتعدد طرقها. He says this is something which is very harmful. Why? Because a student is thereby demanded to memorize and recollect all of those terminologies, or at least most of them. Because this is the reason which Ibn Khaldun is saying, this is very harmful, is that all these terminologies, so you find students sometimes they have to, you find this a lot in the books of fiqh, in the books of the madahib, that you will find that scholars of a particular madhab will define the same terminology that can be found within their madhab differently. So the student, he has to focus and he has to memorize that terminology, the definition of that terminology, the definition of that terminology. It makes it problematic. Makes it problematic. So for example, I'll give you an example. Wajib, according to Hanafi scholars, is a stage lower than fard. So for example, they say that a person who, if he was to, somebody who negates or rejects something absolutely, which is obligatory, makes him a kafir. But with wajib, the Hanafi said that it's detailed, depends on the basis of his rejection or or on the basis of him neglecting it. But there are many scholars who say, from the Hanafi school of thought, they say that sunnatun mu'akkada is synonymous to wajib. Now, this complicate things and emphasize sunnah, wajib, fard. So all these terminologies that come within you then they have this thing of saying that when this word is mentioned, this terminology is mentioned, this is what it is meant. When the mutaqaddimin use it, when the mutaakhirin use it, the later scholars use it, they mean something else. So these type of things in a subject, what does it do? It makes tashattut. It makes the brain of the student or the mind of the student become it becomes complicated. It becomes, what's the word, tashattut? I'm looking for the correct word. Huh? Overwhelmed, as well as clouded, overwhelmed, clouded, and there's another word also I'm looking for. You know, when your mind is all over the place. Yeah, meaning that the student is all over, the mind is all over. The mind is not, yeah, that is, you know, like a jumbo. Yes, the mind is not focused on one particular thing because it's always getting fed with different terminology. By the time he learns that terminology, he has to learn another terminology, which makes him forget the previous terminology. So he has to, and this is what Ibn Khaldun, his criticism is. So certainly the student's lifetime is not enough to study all the books. He says that we have to be realistic. And this is what I said to one of the students when we started studying al-Baiquni. I said, this is the one time that I'm only teaching al-Baiquni, and I don't think I'll ever teach it again in my life. I don't got time. This is one-off thing. I think most of the books that I will teach, I've chosen to teach, I don't think I'll be teaching them again. Some books that I have completed with some students who have been studying with me for many years, I don't think I'll be teaching those books again as well. I've told them, you compile the benefits, the notes, there's no time. So that is the reality, is that you have to be selective. You have to be selective. And in order to select the right books, you have to be wise. And this can only be achieved if you go back to the people of knowledge and the experts. You go back to the people of knowledge and the experts. And you have to be selective, because only Allah knows how much life you have, how many years you're going to live, and how active you're going to be when it comes to seeking knowledge. This problem, Ibn Khaldun says that this problem that we have before us, where you have to be selective, where you're overwhelmed, you're clouded, you're burdened, you always have to learn different terminology, which may be contradictory. This has caused a significant lack in the acquisition of a given discipline. So this is what the Shaykh says. Then he gives an example, and he gives the example of the Maliki school, because I believe that's where his surroundings, the surroundings of Ibn Khaldun, where he was, I believe, the Maliki madhab was quite predominant. He says, so there are books that detail the Maliki school of jurisprudence, meaning that al-fiqh fi madhab al-Maliki. For example, the most famous book of Ibn al-Qasim is al-Mudawwana. And al-Mudawwana is an important text with regards to one of the students of Malik, Ibn al-Qasim. There is some speech whether this book's ascription to Ibn al-Qasim, the student of Malik, is correct or not. But the Orientalists, they say that the Muwatta of Imam Malik is, you can say its credibility is based on Mudawwana. So they use Mudawwana as a benchmark for the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So according to them, they indirectly, what they're trying to say, that there's even articles which I have been reading recently that they said that Malik's not even the author of the Muwatta. This is how far the Orientalists go. Anyway, so this text has become more famous. The book of the student of Imam Malik has become more famous than the actual book of Malik, which is the Muwatta. And then you have all these explanations that are written to it. Kitab of Ibn Yunus, al-Lakhmi, Ibn Bashir, and others. And this is what you find in the madhahib. You'll see a text has been written, and that text has so many different explanations have been written by different scholars. So the Shaykh, he says this, he says multiple explanations on it were authored by all these scholars. Furthermore, a student is required to study and distinguish between the various approaches that teach this Maliki school. This is all complicated. Remember, we keep hearing on social media that madhahib are straightforward. It's a straightforward study. According to Ibn Khaldun, who is an expert on education, who's an expert, and he's not biased or he's not bigoted, he's just giving an example of a madhab, and he's saying, look, these are the problems that you have. And he goes, you have to analyze the various approaches that teach this Malik. Each scholar who's written an explanation has a different approach. So he goes, these approaches are not just even related to the students. These approaches are geographical as well. It depends from where you come from, and you might be a Maliki, but if you're a Maliki from London, might be different to somebody who is a Maliki from Scotland. You know, the approach. And this is what he says. So he says, between the various teachers, those approaches are taught, for example, in Baghdad, Iran, Egypt, Cordoba, not to mention the approaches that were developed after them. Because I'm not going to even talk about all these other approaches that came after them. I'm just going to talk about the early approaches. Even they were so many. While in reality, a lifetime is only enough for studying one approach only. Because if you were to look at these approaches, all these different approaches that we have, you're only going to have enough time if you're studious to actually be able to study one approach from the beginning till the end. And there's so many approaches. So if only teachers restricted themselves. Now, after mentioning this problem and using the Maliki madhab as an example and identifying what's problematic, Ibn Khaldun now gives his thoughts on this actual issue. He says, if only teachers restricting themselves to teaching their students the basic of any discipline, the basic of any discipline, one second. He says, to teach the students the basic of any discipline, learning would be much easier and beneficial. He said, rather than taking their focus, if they were to teach the Masail al-Madhabiyya, or the Mabadi'at, like we say, or the Usas of any discipline, and that would be, learning would be much easier and beneficial. However, the above mentioned method of education has become as rooted as an inborn nature resistant to any modification or change. But this way of studying, and the madhab is an example here, has become so rooted, it is as though as an inborn nature resistant to any modification or change, because there is no change allowed. It's just the system. You have to follow it. You can't question it. You can't modify it. You can't amend it. That's what you have to do, whether you like it or whether you don't like it. And I've experienced this from my own studies when I was studying in India. He says another instance is found in the books that explain the Arabic language. So first he gave an example of a fiqh madhab, and now he's giving an example of the book Sibawayh, Al-Kitab. So Al-Kitab is the famous book of Sibawayh. It's an amazing book. Alhamdulillah, I studied this book when I was in Medina, and I had a one-to-one study with one of the sheikhs from Medina, teaches in the faculty of Lugha. He used to live in the same neighborhood where I lived, which was Hayy Nasr. And once I remember that my car was in the garage, and I was hitchhiking a taxi to go to the Jamia in the morning, and his car was also in the garage. So we were both, because we came from the same neighborhood, we both were hitchhiking for a taxi to go to the Jamia. And the Shaykh, we got into the taxi together. He says, where are you going? I said, I'm going to the Jamia. And he said, oh, I'm going to the Jamia as well. So because he was elder, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he was a professor. So you have a doctor and then you have a professor, al-Ustad al-Doktor. I didn't know that he was teaching Kitab al-Sibawayh in the masjid of Shaykh bin Baz. Jamia bin Baz, there's the masjid of Medina University is called Jamia bin Baz. As soon as you enter the main gates, the masjid that you see, that masjid has been named after Shaykh bin Baz. It's called Jamia bin Baz. So I said to the driver, I said, me And I called him Shaykh due to him being elder than me. I said, me and the Shaykh, I'll take care of the bed, meaning I'll take care of the affair. When I said that, he smiled and he said, no, no, no. And I said, no. No. ليس منا من لم يرحم صغيرنا ولم يوقر كبيرنا. That person is not from amongst us who doesn't show mercy to the young and show respect to the elders. And then we started talking, and then he told me that he's a professor in the faculty of law, and he teaches masters and PhD students. And then I started asking, I said, where do you live? And then I told him I just live behind him. And then he told me to visit him. He said, you have to come and have some tea or some biscuits with me. This is where I live, just around the corner. And we got to the Jamia, and he said, my car's in the garage. And I said to him, my car's in the garage. And then we talked about what had happened to our cars and how, the mechanics always rob us. So I always say that there's 3 people that you can't trust. Umar, there's 3 people that you can't trust. Jahala is shadida in them. One is a mechanic. The second is the one who sells you itar. The one who sells you perfumes. And the third is who sells you honey. These 3 people are not to be trusted absolutely if you don't know them. The tawfiq of these people is necessary. We have our brother here, Zainab's brother, the one who read, Ibrāhīm, Shaykh Abu Ibrāhīm, who studies at the Islamic University of Medina. He bought a car. And this car that he had bought, since he took it to the mechanic, it was in the garage for how many months? Wallahu alam, that I don't know. Every time he came out, it would be back in the garage. Every time I speak to Abu Ibrāhīm, oh, I don't have a car, it's back in the garage. So once we got together at one of the other students' house, and I said to Abu Ibrāhīm, I said, you need to get rid of that car. Go to the scrap yard and get rid of it. Because I don't know what these mechanics keep doing. Every time I take them for one problem, they solve that problem, and then another problem comes up. So the mechanics are not to be trusted. And then I went to see the Shaykh, and we actually became good friends. And so he was quite fascinated because he's an Egyptian. By the way, he's an Egyptian. He's not Saudi, he's an Egyptian. He actually was the head of a branch of Al-Azhar University. Alhamdulillah, he's Aqidah, he's Salafi. And we discussed about some issues on Al-Asma wa Sifat, and the Jamia is very strict on those issues anyway. Alhamdulillah. And he said to me that he has he wanted to learn English. He said, I've learned English, I need to brush up on my English. So first I said to him, no. I said, Shaykh, I don't have time. And he said to me, I tell you what, why don't we make munawala? You teach me English and I teach you Arabic. I said to myself, as soon as he said, I said, Kitab al-Sibawayh, Shaykh. He said, yes, I'll teach you. I got the one that you're teaching in the masjid, private lessons, 1-to-1. He said, nah, 1, you're my neighbor. 2nd, you're gonna help me learn English. So anyway, the English lessons went out of the window because he became so busy. But he didn't stop my lessons, alhamdulillah, because I was on his case. So we had that friendship, that neighbor. We used to call each other neighbors. Jari, he used to call me, Ya Jari. My neighbor. I was always say to him, whenever he would say, Shaykh is a bit busy, I said, the Prophet ﷺ said, Jibreel, that I fear that Jibreel alayhi salam would make so much wasiyah to me with regards to the neighbors that I thought that they were going to be inheriting from one another. The Shaykh would say, okay, I'm going to give you time. When I had my viva, before I wrote my introduction, you have to write an introduction to the viva. I presented it to two scholars before I wrote it and asked for their opinions. One of them was the Shaykh Abdul Qadir, and the other one was Shaykh al-Usaylan. Both of them masters of the Arabic language. And I mean masters, great masters of the Arabic language. Anyway, this was something which was a side point for you to know, with some of the great memories that I cherish from Medina University. But I remember he told me to buy a really old edition of Al-Kitab, Sibawayh. I spent a lot of money on that, and I phoned him actually when I was in the book fair. I said, Shaykh, this Egyptian that had come from Egypt, when they see that you are desperate to buy books, then they really torture you. They rip you off. You call it in street language. What do they do, Umar? They rip you off. I found him. I said, Shaykh, I'm buying Al-Kitab. This is the edition, and I found it. He said to me, all the editions, but this is the best edition if you get printed from Egypt, from Cairo. I bought it. And I said to him, Shaykh, it's in my library now, alhamdulillah. I have this particular edition. He said to me, one day, you'll thank me. And then I've seen a lot of these other editions that came out. And they were, in terms of their editing, they were nonsense. If you know about books and editions, so I'm a person who's always, if you ever visit me in Medina, then you'll know that my library is not what I have on my shelf, it's the editions that matter to me. So sometimes you might find 4 or 5 different editions to one book. I remember once my mum came, and I was just the mom in Medina, and she saw one book, read the title, and she said, these are all the same books. Why you got 4 copies of these? She asked me. So I explained back to her. I said, Mom, this is to do with different editions. She goes, what do you mean different editions? A book is a book. You buy one, that's it. Why do you have to buy 4 different editions for this? I said, each edition has something which the other doesn't have. So she said, that's a lot of money. And then I said to her, that's why I have a good mummy like you. As who's always buying me books, alhamdulillah. So it's a good thing, alhamdulillah, with regards to this book, and it's one of the highest, it's at the advanced level, Al-Kitab. If you're able to study that, then it's very good. So anyway, there was lots of commentaries have been written in Al-Kitab, written in addition to the copious teaching approaches of different schools in Basra, Kufa. So we find again the same thing we find in the madhabs of fiqh. We find madhabs. There's also madhabs in the Arabic language. The 2 famous madhabs that you have in the Arabic language is the madhab of Basra and the madhab of Kufa. So you have different madhabs in the Arabic language: Basra, Kufa, Baghdad, Spain. Besides the approaches of scholars like Ibn al-Hajj and Ibn Malik. Everybody knows Ibn Malik, Al-Fiyat Ibn Malik, everybody's heard it. And others who taught this book. So you had different approaches as well as different scholars who explained and taught Al-Kitab of Sibawayh. So the student is demanded to cover these huge stacks of different books and approaches. And it is extremely rare for someone to cover all of them. It's impossible for you to read everything. So you have to prioritize. You have to select what you are going to read. Once you read one book in your life, only Allah knows that you will have the tawfiq to read that book again. I'll mention another story, another benefit, because we're talking about books, is our Shaykh of Jami Salafiyya, India, Banaras, India, was writing his 5th volume on Abu Hanifa. And he wrote a letter to me in Medina from India. So I would receive a letter, one letter every week. This is going 2001, just after the 9/11 attacks. I remember this. So I received a letter from the Shaykh, and I said to the Shaykh, I said, Shaykh, the Shaykh wrote to me. He said to me that I've stopped writing. I've stopped writing. So I asked him the reason of why have you stopped writing? He says, I don't have the resources. They are not at my disposal. The Shaykh, if you know the Shaykh, rahimahullah, he had a very strong character. I mean, there's reports about him is that he's made students cry in class with beards. He started to discipline you, he could make you cry. I remember myself once that I was in the bathroom. When I was staying in Jami Salafiyya, I was staying opposite him. And he told me to stay opposite him. And they have a guest house which was donated by King Khalid, rahimahullah ta'ala, Jami Salafiyya, which has AC, fans, nice beds. The room opposite him had those classical Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani beds that break your back. Those that, I don't know if you've seen those type of beds. They literally, if you're not used to sleeping on them, they call it the atla. It breaks your back. I was staying there, and the toilets were there. The Shaykh was that if you were not punctual when it came to his lessons, he would kick you out. I got ready for the lesson, and before the lesson started, I went to the bathroom. As I went into the bathroom, the water finished. Typical scenario in India. When you go, there's no water. I'm opening the tap, there's no water. What am I supposed to do now? So I had to shout and make some noise for somebody to come. And then that person went and he got me water, and I'm waiting inside the toilet. These are tests. If you're a student of knowledge and you don't go through these tests, you're not a real student of knowledge. Anyway, I got everything done and I was 5 minutes late. As soon as I got to the door of the Shaykh's room, the Shaykh was bedridden. He used to sit on his bed. He was waiting. He said to me, go outside, stand outside. I went and I stood outside. And one of the other Shaykhs, he's passed away now as well. He was one of the senior Shaykhs. He came, he said, Shaykh, what are you doing outside? I go, I'm late. He goes, how did you get late? And I whispered to him, I go, I was in the toilet, and I go, the water finished. He said, let me go and tell the Shaykh. I said, no. 45 minutes he made me stand there. After that, he called me in, and then he said to me, a student of knowledge that comes all the way from England, all the way from Medina, and he's playing with flies. What a shame. I just put my head down and said, Shaykh, shall I read? So he basically, for the first 5 minutes, he really told me off. You don't take anything at heart when your teacher tells you off. Afterwards, before I was leaving, he called me and he found out what happened. That's the only day I got late. And he said to me, why didn't you come and tell me? I said, Shaykh, there's no need for me to justify myself. You're my Shaykh. He said, are you upset that I told you off? I said, Wallah, Wallah. A student of knowledge can never be upset with what his teacher says to him, whether he's right or whether he's wrong. Because the teacher has something which the student is in need of, which is his knowledge. So anyway, going back to the issue of the Shaykh writing to me. So he had a problem with the administration of Jami Salafiyya. And most of everybody in Jamia Salafiyya is from amongst his students. Everybody, from the principal. And he had his principles, and he would not ask the library for the books. So I wrote back to him and I said to him, I said, Shaykh, I will facilitate for you this book that you need. Let me know the name of the book, and I will get that book for you. And then the book will be yours. And then you can write your 5th volume. He wrote a letter back to me, and he said to me, thanking me and making dua for me. I said, all I need is your dua, ya Shaykh. I said, this is a service to the Muslim Ummah. This is a service to the people of Hadith. In fact, this is a chance that Allah has given me to do it in honor of the Prophet ﷺ and to defend the Sunnah. So I took the name of the book and I went to the bookshop and I said to him, do you have this book? The guy looked at me. Syrian guy. He said, you sure you want this book? I said, yeah, I need this book. He said, sure. He said, where you study? I just arrived. I said, I'm studying in Ma'had al-Lugha. He said to me, Ma'had al-Lugha, Arabic Language Institute, and you want this book? He goes, it's 80 volumes. Tariq ibn Asakir, Tariq Dimashq, he said it's 80 volumes. How many volumes? 80 volumes. And he said to me, well, very few people buy this book anyway. We have a very limited stock. I said to him, I need this book. He said to me, who is it for? I said, it's for the Shaykh, one of our Shaykhs. He said, well, I only know the great scholars come in here and ask for this book, so this person must be somebody high up there. So anyway, I bought the book. To cut the story short, the book got transported. We bought the book with some of the students of the Shaykh. I went to one of the senior students of the Shaykh who was doing his PhD. I told him, facilitated it. We bought the book, alhamdulillah. There was some brothers and sisters who contributed as well. At that time, it was 1,500 riyals. That time, 2001. 80 volumes. And we said the book reached the Shaykh, alhamdulillah. It reached the Shaykh. And it reached the Shaykh before I went to India to see the Shaykh. When I reached India, Shaykh had finished writing his 5th volume. He was actually editing and proofreading. And I don't know if you've ever seen Shaykh Rais Nadwi's handwriting. Shaykh Rais Nadwi's handwriting is like reading a manuscript. Only few people can read his writing. I'm one of them. Because we wrote to each other for almost 20 years. I can read his handwriting, alhamdulillah, very clearly. I remember when I read his first letter that he sent to me, it took me 4 hours, 5 hours to read a few sentences. It actually took me 6-7 days to actually work out what was written. He writes really small. And when I got there, I asked him, I said, Shaykh, did you read Tariq ibn Asakir? He said, yes. He said, I read the whole book, which is 80 volumes, 3 times. How many times? 3 times, from cover to cover. His habitual reading average every single day, they say, was 18 to 18 hours. And then the rest of the hours you split between food, drink, sleeping, resting, everything. 18 hours a day the Shaykh used to read, till he completely became bedridden. If you went on his bed, he would have books that he would read. He'd have big glasses, and if you asked him a question, he would be reading like this. If you asked him a question, he'd put the book down, he'd answer your question. Then he'd pick the book up again. That was his casual style of reading, but his real reading, he told me. So everybody is not Rais Nadwi. Everybody is not Rais Nadwi. Not everybody can be like Rais Nadwi that can read such a level. So you have to prioritize and you have to select the books which you are going to read in your life. That's why time is very precious. Qimatul Zaman, the value of time. If a student of knowledge does not have value of time, he can't be a student of knowledge. Take this from what Ibn Khaldun is saying. Think about now what Ibn Khaldun is saying and see how important it is to understand in your lifetime you are only going to be able to study certain books. And even if those books, they're not structured and your selection is not the right selection, that even that's going to be a waste of time. As Ibn Khaldun said, all it's going to do is it's going to mash up your brain. You're not going to really benefit. So this is what the Shaykh said. This is what Ibn Khaldun, he said when he talked about Sibawayh's book, and then scholars came after it. So you won't be able to read everything everybody wrote. That's why before Fathul Bari was written, and does everybody know why Fathul Bari is so important? Everybody knows that Fathul Bari is the explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari written by Ibn Hajar. You'll always find in books refer to Fathul Bari, refer to Fathul Bari, refer to Fathul Bari. Ibn Hajar, he read over 100 explanations of Sahih al-Bukhari that were written before he wrote his Fathul Bari. Then his explanation, which is Fathul Bari, is like a summary of 110 explanations. Who's going to be like Ibn Hajar and be able to read over 100 explanations? So that's why Fathul Bari became so famous, that when they asked Shawkani from Yemen, why don't you write a Sharh of Sahih al-Bukhari? He said, La hijrata ba'd al-fath. Famous statement. There is no hijrah after al-fath. This is what the Prophet said after Fath Makkah. There's no hijrah, meaning that you don't need to go anywhere to learn Sahih al-Bukhari after you have Fathul Bari. Fathul Bari is your final destination. If you have Fathul Bari, then there's no need for anybody else to write an explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari. And it's true from the time of Ibn Hajar till this day. No matter how many explanations have been written after Ibn Hajar's explanation, nobody comes to the level of Ibn Hajar's Fathul Bari. So he mentioned here, he said one exception is Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham was a great scholar of the Arabic language, the Egyptian who authored a book in grammar that reflected mastery in this discipline, similar to that of Sibawayh. So we have Ibn Hisham, who is another Arabic language expert, a master of the Arabic language. And you have Ibn Jinni also, and those in the same level as them. So these two are very famous and quite popular, Ibn Jinni and Ibn Hisham. So he mastered the fundamentals and everything related to grammar. Ibn Hisham, notably, such an extreme rare example proves that mastery is not exclusive to earlier scholars. You have to understand this. There is a generic principle that the earlier scholars came, they're always going to be the pioneers and the founders of that discipline and the masters of that discipline. And those who come after them will not be able to stand shoulder to shoulder. This is the generic rule. But every single generic rule has an exception. And the exception is that there were scholars who came after these great scholars and excelled. They excelled and they surpassed some of these great scholars in knowledge. And that's what the Shaykh says. He says, and Ibn Hisham and Ibn Jinni were from those exceptional scholars. They were from the exception, from لِكُلِّ قَاعِدَةٍ. They say that لِكُلِّ قَاعِدَةٍ اسْتِثْنَائِيَّةٍ. Every single generic rule has an exception. The early scholars, despite the whom he wills. So that's why we find that I remember reading the biography of Abdul Jalil as-Samrudi, one of the great scholars of India, who died in the 1970s. And he mentioned in his autobiography, which he wrote himself, he said that when I went to make Umar, I went to make Hajj. I was a small boy. He said, I knew of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ma'u Zamzam lima shuriba. And he goes, my father, or his guardian, whoever was with him, I can't remember whether it was his father, but whoever he went to do Hajj, if I'm not mistaken, it was his father. His father told him that any dua that you will make when drinking Zamzam, after drinking Zamzam, Allah will accept that dua of yours. So he said that I made this dua, that Allah make me a greater scholar than Imam al-Bukhari in hadith. And that Allah make me a greater scholar than Ibn Hajar in tahqiq. And he mentioned a few du'as that he made. And he said that if I was to say that Allah has not blessed me with some of the du'as I made, then I would be, and he says, I only mention this not on the basis of being arrogant or boasting or showing off, but I mentioned this under the premise of وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ. And he said, I, Abdul Jalil As-Samrodi, say clearly that I have understood Sahih al-Bukhari without reading Fathul Bari, which is literally impossible in his time, and even today, because I have not read Fathul Bari. Walillah alhamd. In fact, he says that I say that sometimes I would open Fathul Bari to see what Ibn Hajar said on this issue, and I would find a lot of the times that his research, his tahqiq and my tahqiq was exactly the same. In fact, I would find that on certain issues where Ibn Hajar remained quiet, I have spoken about them in detail. So this is possible. And a living example of this is Albani. The haters of Albani, may Allah darken their faces. Oh guide. Albani, rahimahullah, as our Shaykh Wasiul Abbas always says, was living in the wrong century. He was from the wrong century. If he had not known Albani was alive amongst us, we would have probably thought that he lived a few hundred years ago. So again, Albani excelled and he mastered in many areas where many scholars of the past centuries didn't. And this is what Ibn Khaldun is saying with regards to Ibn Hisham and Ibn Jinn. So however, generally speaking, a student who spends his lifetime seeking to learn linguistics, which is merely a tool for the most important disciplines, would not cover the entire subject. Would not cover the entire subject. Almost say, and Ibn Khaldun's intaha kalamu, and then Shaykh al-Islam, he says that Ibn Khaldun wrote a very critical and a must-read chapter in his book. Everybody who is in the teaching profession must read, understand, and consider it a measurement to which his teaching performance is measured. If you want to become these Westerners, I will tell you one thing now. These Westerners and Orientalists, they take the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun like the Bible. Because there is so much knowledge of different areas of what Ibn Khaldun has spoken about. I remember our Shaykh, Mufti Muhammad Ali Snadbi rahmatullahi alayhi, he said that he taught this Muqaddimah 6 years. For 6 years in Jami Salafiyya. He said, I know the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun from cover to cover. Because I taught it for 6 years, he said. And you can see the reflection of Ibn Khaldun in the books of our Shaykh. And he's so articulate when he talks about something, you can see this. So, being a great teacher, a mudarris, a muallim, the first people who talked about turuq al-tadris and the methodology and all these things that we have of how to teach non-native speakers and all, Ibn Khaldun talked about this centuries ago. And the West was sleeping. So it's a book which the people must read. And what is surprising about Sibawayh, as you all know, is that Sibawayh wasn't even an Arab. What was he? He was Persian. He wasn't even a native speaker of the Arabic language. They say that Sibawayh, he was Persian, Farsi. They say that Sibawayh was so strong in both languages, in Farsi and in Arabic, that he could instantly switch to the language, within the languages, or whatever he was teaching. That's how proficient he was, instantly. Whatever he's teaching, he could just switch into the other language and teach what he's teaching in the other language, and then switch back. So it's important for us to know this. What we have read today has been very beneficial and an eye-opener for us. Prioritizing, selecting sensibly, and acknowledging the fact that you need to study the right books with the right people of knowledge. Otherwise, all your time will be wasted. And that's why we see that progression in the West is at a snail-paced level of progression. I remember Shaykh Osiola said to me, he said, I think the people have been learning al-Usul al-Thalath and al-Qawaid al-Arba for the past 25 years. No progression. That's what the people have been learning. He said, those who claim themselves to be Salafis, that's all we hear. Al-Qawaid al-Arba, al-Usul al-Thalatha, Medina Book 1, Medina Book 2, and the miracle of it's Medina Book 3. Otherwise, everybody's in. They start and they leave, they start and they leave. Al-Usul al-Thalatha, Qawaid al-Arba, Kitab al-Tawheed. That's probably about it. Illa ma rahimahullah. So build your foundations, those students of knowledge. Reflect upon what Ibn Khaldun has said. Know that every second of your life is precious. Every time you pick up a book from the shelf, is it the right book that you have picked up? Is it the book that is going to be beneficial for you? Is it appropriate for you? Is this the right choice that you have made? You can't make these decisions independently. You need guidance for this. You need to refer back to the people of knowledge. And the crazy thing about the people of the West is that they don't want to refer back to the people of knowledge. It seems that they just want to do everything independently. They want to be Johnny English. Everything by himself. Have breakfast by yourself, live by yourself, eat by yourself, sleep by yourself. You know, that total independence. This is the environment that you see with the people. Whereas we are people who are different from this. And we need to change our ways, and we need to attach ourselves to the people of knowledge. And remember, every subject that you study, don't go asking a scholar in Aqidah about a book in the Arabic language. That is also stupidity. Every single fun has an expert. So go back to the expert. If I want some construction work done, then I'm not going to go to the plumber, am I? I'm going to go to the builder. Although the plumber might be the best plumber in London. If I go to the plumber, what's him being the best plumber in London got to do with construction, with my extension, if I want to build one? I'm going to go to the builder who is an expert in building. Regardless, and all due respect to the one who is the best plumber in London. So we need to understand this. If you have a teacher who is able to mentor you, able to guide you, able to direct you in different areas and different subjects, so this is a ni'mah. Stick to that person. For surely he will help you your progression level. He will help you excel and progress with the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We stop here. Jazakumullahu khairah. Wa baraka feekum. Next point is how to teach students. This is an amazing point that must be remembered. which we shall continue next week if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Most probably because of Eid being on Saturday, we may not have a lesson next Wednesday. We may not have Monday and Tuesday for sure, but Wednesday is pending, inshallah. By Monday, I will be able to let you know because I may be traveling. Allah knows best. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Any questions before we finish?
No, Shaykh, no questions today.
We have a question here now, Ibrāhīm.
You mentioned some people were less to the parts. You mentioned how some people don't read like 18 hours, 18 hours. I read something like this on the space. The question that comes to mind is, if they're dedicating so much time just learning knowledge, what time do they spend revising it? As a student with kids, the commitment required just to maintain kids seems like such a big commitment. I'm unable to make the commitment to seek knowledge, but on top of that, just keeping my kids is so much. How do you keep your kids and with all of this stuff?
No. So the student he asked the question is that when we find and we see and we read in the biographies of many of the scholars that they would read 17 to 18 hours and they excel in knowledge, how did they preserve that knowledge? Preservation of knowledge included the 18 hours that they may have read, which meant that they revised their knowledge by teaching. Revised the knowledge by teaching. This is also included in the 18 hours of study. Because when you are teaching, you're actually reading. Now you are actually reading. You want to say this is included in that time. One of the ways was that this is what they did, that they would teach. Secondly, is the scholars did revise their knowledge in the 18 hours of for example, in the many hours of reading, they would have a time and they would read. For example, for Shaykh Abdul Aziz bin Baz rahmatullah alayhi, they said that Fathul Majid was read cover to cover to him once a year of Kitab al-Tawheed, the Sharh of Kitab al-Tawheed. Also, we find that the people of knowledge, they had something which is called al-Mudhakara ilmiyya. They would revise their knowledge with the students, and then they would revise that knowledge. Not teach, but revise that knowledge. So there's many different methods in which how knowledge was preserved. But two things that I noticed, which are very important, is most of these scholars who I saw, who are of such nature, that they read for many hours, they had two strong qualities which a student of knowledge should always ask for when seeking knowledge. One is that they had strong memories. Secondly, the grasp of comprehension was of a very high level. They would be able to understand and comprehend the most complicated issues very simply. And this made them what they were. So if you want to ask Allah, then ask Allah for these qualities that I've seen with consistency. All the scholars that I have sat with, and I see that all of them had one thing which was very common, and that was a powerful memory. Even at the end of their life, some of them may have forgotten things due to old age. This happens. But I know that, I think it was said about our Shaykh, Mufti Muhammad Rais Nadwi rahmatullah alayhi, at the end of his life, that if he didn't have, at the end of his life, the shortcoming of some loss of memory, they said it would have been very difficult to find somebody in the world that would be able to stand in front of him in terms of memory. I mean, Shaykh Ghulamullah Rahmati, the Shaykh that passed away, the Pashtu Shaykh, or the Shaykh from Peshawar, Shaykh Salih As-Sindhi, who studied with him, who's also a student of Bin Baz, and he also is one of my teachers, one of my sheikhs who I study Aqidah with and who teaches in Medina. He said to me that Ghulamullah Rahmati was like a computer. Just tuck, and he'll tell you that when you ask him where this reference can be found, he'll tell you the volume number, the page number, and it actually even tell you the line number where it starts from. I noticed one thing, and I asked a lot of the scholars, and they said that we believe in رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي رب زدني علما. They said that these du'as, these ad'iyah which Allah has mentioned in the Quran and which can be found in the hadith of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have to have conviction and you have to truly beg Allah for them. And then Allah opens your heart, and Allah knows best. Now, I will stop here then. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.